welcome to this very special edition of Get Kafka-Nated. We're closing out our show for 2025 with something a little bit different. This has been a massive year for Kafka. We've seen major architectural shifts all over the streaming space with things like diskless Kafka. We've seen market consolidation, and we've seen the streaming infrastructure market evolve in real time. So instead of me trying to make sense of this all alone, I brought in some experts. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by streaming educator and author of Apache Kafka in Action, Anthony Zellin. And I'm also joined by no fewer than 3 Apache Kafka committers, which is very exciting. Joined by the Kafka guy himself from 2 Minute Streaming, Stanislav, senior software engineer at Red Hat, Luke Chen, and longtime member of the Apache Kafka project, and streaming services senior engineering director at Aiven, Joseph Pratt. Try saying that 3 times quickly. Thank you, all of you, for joining me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. So you may have noticed the Dickensian theme to this show. Thank you, marketing, for that one. We're going to be looking at Apache Kafka in terms of the past of Kafka, so for 2025, the present, and looking forward into the future for 2026. So I'd like to start by going around to everyone in the room, doing a little bit of a round robin, and ask, what is your pick for the biggest piece of Kafka news from 2025? Stan, should we start with you?
Hey, you have to be on the show. Biggest Kafka news of the year. Well, I think definitely I was going to say diskless if you asked me a month ago. It's kind of hard, but now I would say it was IBM acquiring Confluent. I think that was the biggest news, and a little people expected Confluent being sold this year, let alone to IBM. It's kind of like me doing a retro of the year. It's hard to compartmentalize that we had both the diskless thing release and the IBM acquisition happen the same year. It's been a long year in Kafka.
Joseph, what are your thoughts?
I was thinking about what happened, and so many things happened so we kicked Zookeeper out. On a normal year, that's already enough to make headlines. Diskless, more than enough to do headlines, and not just one diskless proposal, but rather 3 different proposals for that one. And on top of that, what Stan said. So because IBM acquisition of Confluent is not so much about Kafka itself, the project, I will stick semantically to the question, and I would say diskless, or the move to the cloud to be cloud native. So it's the diskless proposal, but also the other competing KIPs that were proposed during this year. I will stay with this one.
Luke, I know I've seen you in the mailing lists on all kinds of really exciting stuff for Kafka this year. What are your thoughts on the most exciting news? Yeah, you can ignore the noise behind me. Sorry, go for it.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing as Stan, that our company is going to acquire another company that was a competitor in our area. So yeah, but in addition to that, I think, yeah, I'm really happy to see, like Joseph said, there are multiple KIPs published to fix the same problem at the same time, which is quite amazing. That means our community is very, very, very enthusiastic and to fixing the problem, to resolving the problems. So yeah, that makes me very excited.
It makes me very excited too. Anatoly, I know this has been a busy year for you. What have been your highlights?
I would say the year started quite well with the finally we got rid of Zookeeper. Finally we got Kafka 4.0. I was hoping, so since I started Kafka, this was my question to every committer: when do we get rid of Zookeeper? When do we get Kafka 4.0? And they always said in 2 years. But finally 2025 became the year. And I would even say, yeah, diskless is nice, but the new consumer group rebalance protocol, which works now very well for consumers, and then with Kafka 4.2, but this is next year, getting also available for Kafka streams, makes things much simpler and more reliable for consumers. And I think this is also a very important step forward for the simplicity of Kafka, but I think we have a long way to go. And of course, what Stan said with the acquisition of Confluent by IBM will, let's see where the community will be heading, because this year it seems was the year of Iceberg and everything Iceberg, and diskless. Let's see what will be the topic of next year.
I am very fond of saying that Iceberg is the hottest topic of 2025, awful pun though that may be.
But also, I just wanted to add, like, we had Qs released in EA2, which I think is also great news. And I was misremembering, I just looked it up. Tiered storage went GA in November last year. I almost thought it was this year as well. But also huge news.
Time flies. I know that tiered storage has also seen a lot of work since then. Talking about that work that goes into, building the Apache Kafka project, I know a few people mentioned Zookeeper there. Very lucky to have 3 committers on the call today. What foundational work happened in 2025 that most users maybe won't have noticed, away from the big ticket items like Zookeeper and like these kind of refinements on tiered storage, but it's going to really matter in the long term for the project? Putting you on the spot here a little bit. I was thinking, as maintainers, like, what are the things that you've seen that are like bringing quality of life for working on the project? I think a good example for me, as someone who's attempted to dip my toe into contributing to Apache Kafka before, is this long-awaited move from the existing website for Apache Kafka to the Markdown, which is very exciting.
That is indeed exciting, and it has been a long project, and even with a pause in between, I would say. That's an interesting thing, and probably will help newcomers to the project to read better and to contribute better to documentation. One thing that it was an email that just was sent this morning, and it's a discussed thread, not even a KIP yet, but there was a person asking, hey, can we please define what are public APIs in Kafka? Because I'm tired of discussing with people that's a public API and that's not a public API. So I would actually even be tempted to say this discussion is actually one of the important ones for Apache Kafka, to make sure that we know that whoever is contributing outside of Apache Kafka, because Apache Kafka is different things. Apache Kafka on its own is awesome, but it's also the sum of every single component that is around it, either tools like Streamzy, all the connectors, for example, and connectors suffer extremely from this problem. Like, connector code might be depending on classes that are not public. Kafka changes something, connector is broken, on a patch release. That should never happen. So I would even say, and it's a really bold thing to say, that on 17th of December, the biggest thing to watch out is an email thread that happened today. I think that thread is an interesting one.
That's a good point. I remember, I think it's in the KIP templates that we designed what the public API is, or some hidden doc like this. I remember when I was contributing more heavily, everybody would get it wrong all the time, and I would always be the one leaving a comment, this is a public API, you sure you want to change it, etc. So the same question, I think, from foundational work. I mean, you can answer this in many different ways, but I think the queues thing is underrated at the same time, while it's not underrated. It's not underrated in the sense that I get a lot of people read about it whenever I post, so I think everyone is really excited about it. But I feel like we don't talk enough about it, and I'm curious how it will change the trajectory of how Kafka is used, and whether it will enable more of these OLTP applications to be used with Kafka. Another similar trend that I see today is Aiven releasing this free tier and hinting about some sort of dev tier for Apache Kafka. I don't know if you can speak about that, but I'm beginning to see a little bit of a shift towards application level OOTP Kafka for apps, basically, which we've seen be used before. I mean, there was the parallel consumer library by Confluent. That was a consumer level library that allows you to use a queue. I think there is a big future in queues, in queue-like workloads. So I'm excited to see what happens there. But this is the type of work that I think will need maybe 3 years at least to pan out, because client APIs are very slow to change and to gain adoption and stuff like that.
I think that's similar to what happened with tiered storage as well. That tiered storage was in the work for so long, and only now we are starting to see people adopting tiered storage and actually now starting to push tiered storage as the practice, the best practice. So that happens most of the times when you break one boundary, that one thing that was not a best use case for Kafka that now becomes a best use case, or now it's allowed. It takes a long time until it goes from smells to best practices, and that shift takes time. So I agree with you, Stan. Queues are important and interesting, and I think it will take some time to get into the mainstream, if we want to call it this way, because we need more time for people to understand the best practices, change old habits, and start using them.
I believe that tiered storage is also, it's foundational work that a lot of people don't know and don't see. And especially if you're using Kafka on premises, I think tiered storage changes the whole calculation of how to use Kafka and what to store in Kafka. Because for me, tiered storage changes everything in the way that finally you can store data forever for cheap in Kafka, even though we still have this annoying limitations of compacted topics that are not supported. We still have the GDPR and friends problem of how do I actually delete data from Kafka, and this gets very important if you have tiered storage. And I also very much like the quality of life improvements. So saying the new consumer rebalance protocol, for example, I mentioned before, but also a relatively small KIP, which was just, let's change the defaults. Let's change the defaults for the producers to more reasonable values. Let's change the defaults for the topics. And I think this doesn't look like a lot, but from my experience, especially people that are not too much into Kafka and that just use Kafka don't know about that, and they rely a lot on defaults, and they are not always optimal in Kafka.
I really like that point on defaults. I think coming at this from my perspective of working in developer relations, where my job is to help people get up and running using open source projects like this one, quite often defaults catch people out so often, and I think they can perhaps be some of the most controversial things to change, particularly for an open source project, because you're making a series of assumptions about people's use case. But yeah, that's one that I would be very interested to see kind of further refinements in. Luke, I think we've not heard from you yet on this one. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about any kind of foundational work this year for Apache Kafka.
Yeah, one thing comes to my mind is that I can't remember it happened this year or last year, but I want to mention that the GitHub workflow to do the CI, change the CI to the GitHub action, which makes the development efficiency very improve very, 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 very much. So previously, I still remember as a committer, when you want to merge your PR, you have to go to Jenkins, and check the results. But mostly the result will not be green. Will not be green. You have to filter out by yourself. Say some of them should be flaky. Some of them should be related to this change, and all by your experience. So, and that's why sometimes it will happen that why do you let this in without checking the results? but I did. I can tell if not related to this change. But right now we can see, I cannot say 100% of the time it will be green, but maybe 70, 80 will be green, which improve a lot of efficiency. I love that very much. I think that's the biggest change, I think, for this year.
Yeah, I think these flaky tests have always been an issue. I remember when I first joined Confluent in 2018, we had the flaky issue again in Apache Kafka. We always had red builds, and one of the first things I did, I think, being a hungry young dev wanting to fix the issue, I sent an email on the discuss thread of multiple other Apache projects, basically saying something along the lines of, "Hey, we're struggling with flaky tests here in Kafka. I'm curious, how do you solve this issue?" And I was quickly told off that it didn't look like good optics for the Kafka project. But yeah, that's a good advancement. I think another foundational work that is maybe appreciated, maybe not, is the general move to S3. There are a couple of trends here. So first one is the obvious tiered storage, which GA'd now and basically lets you store infinite data in Kafka, or basically in S3 in a Kafka-like format. Then we have the diskless trend, which I sort of see as an accelerant to this trend. So diskless with the warp stream and all the other projects that came out, and now with diskless topics being proposed. And the Iceberg trend as well, which is industry-wide and not only Kafka, but also in Kafka we have the table flow, and basically every vendor supporting some form of Iceberg table support for Kafka data, as well as in the open source with Iceberg topics in the tier storage plugin directly, or with the Iceberg connector. We're moving very fast to this world where our historical data, our non-hot data in Kafka goes into S3 and is potentially stored in an Iceberg format. Two threads to unravel here. The first one is simpler. We had two new KIPs in the last month, KIP 1255 and 1248, that both propose ways to efficiently read from the code data store, meaning read from S3. One of them is client-side, so it proposed the client to read from S3 directly, and the other one proposes spinning up sort of read replicas of certain partitions, so you can not hit the hot brokers when you're reading from S3. I think that's an interesting development. That's basically building a building block on top of this S3 native storage. But I think the bigger impact thing that's in the long term, that's going to come in the long term, is outsourcing a lot of the data to S3 and in an Iceberg format. And I've commented on this a few months ago, but I think it has a real risk of eating up a share of Kafka's market share, actually. Instead of necessarily needing a consumer to load some data, maybe not exactly in real time, something like a batch format, you may just use some Iceberg engine to read the same data, or even process it instead of reading it and then pushing it to the engine. I think that's very deflationary in the sense of it kills some of these Kafka pipelines that you might have had before. This, again, will take many years to pan out, but that's the trend I'm seeing. And we are actively building the foundational work with tiered storage, with diskless, with the Iceberg topics or Iceberg format. So curious what the rest of you think about it.
I think that was my first thought when first hearing about like Kafka directly to Iceberg, was that we would have a world in which maybe Kafka becomes your data layer that you're querying directly from engine. But whether or not that is an anti-pattern today, or whether or not that is something that, when this work happens, becomes a much more meaningful in the use case in the future, I'm not sure. Like, what are everyone's thoughts on that?
So I think my problem with Iceberg is that Iceberg is purely for the analytical use cases of Kafka, and it's not an OLTP database. So what I'm looking for, or what I could see, is more the distinction between, okay, we use Kafka, the Kafka protocol, for the OLTP, for the transactional data, for microservices and services that are interested in the latest data and update their own materialized view of the world. And then for analytics, you use Iceberg and stuff like that. I wouldn't say it will reduce the market, or I don't think it will reduce the market share for Kafka, but just the way how we use it might change. So we still need Kafka to get the data into Iceberg, but you will probably not use a connector, but maybe you just access it directly, as you said, Stan. And so basically you will have multiple views on the same data, and what I'm thinking about is also, okay, we have Kafka for the streaming data, we have Iceberg for the tabular data for analytics. Do we need also a tabular view on the data in Kafka for operational data?
What did you call it? The last one? What data?
For operational data. So basically a row-based access to data in Kafka and not a column-based like an Iceberg.
Joseph, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I mean, I wanted to say something before Anatoly said this last bomb. Yes, probably we do have that need. I would need to think about it deeper. But I going back to the original point that Stan was raising, I do believe there will be some use cases that probably will become maybe not obsolete, but probably not so much in use. But we need to remember that Kafka is not just the sole purpose of Kafka is not just to push data into the lake. That's only one of the cases. There is plenty of applications that need access to this streaming data. That's why Kafka is successful, and that's why Kafka looks the way it looks like. So while some use cases might shrink or might get a less relevancy in the future, and we will have better ways of achieving those goals without so much tooling around, all the other use cases that we have right now, they're still valid, they're still working, and we still need Kafka for them. So yes, probably there will be diminishing use cases, but only on some, which actually we make it so good that Kafka directly supports that use case that before you needed a lot of tooling and mechanisms to make it work.
One thing I'd love to explore with you guys before we move on to talking about where Kafka is today, and to address the obvious elephant in the room with IBM and Confluent, would be what this year were the kind of the annoying or the unexpected challenges for maintaining open source Kafka? Like, what were the kind of stumbling blocks and the headaches this year? Go for it, Joseph.
I would probably claim that it hasn't been a special complicated year. It has been a year like others. One thing, and now I'm thinking on top of my head, I'm not actually counting things, but I do believe we even had the same amount of releases as previous year. And if not, it was roughly the same number of them. We've had new committers joining the project. We've seen some committers probably leaving the project. Also, we can probably say some folks at Aiven have been less active on the upstream work because we were busy doing something, one KIP, and implementing that KIP. But I'm not seeing a bigger challenge this year than the normal usual challenges that we have had. And the usual ones that we have is usually reviewers, and that's usually the biggest one that in every single open source project exists, is not enough reviewers or too many contributors and too few reviewers for the number of contributors.
Yeah, I think things have been going surprisingly smooth and well, actually. We had two competing ideas with the Slack KIP and diskless topics. And 2 days ago, Slack replied that they're going to co-author diskless, and they're jumping on the diskless bandwagon with the Aiven folks, apparently. So I think that's very positive news. In the span of 6 months, we had two competing proposals, and we already have alignment between at least the two proposals on what we're going to sort of put our efforts behind. So I think that's very positive. I would have, if you asked me 6 months ago, I would have probably predicted it would have taken longer than that. So that's also a positive development.
Yeah, I want to take this opportunity to thank a PMC member, Japin, leading a group of people contributing the Apache Kafka, which make bring in some new some new members and some new ideas into here to, to, like Joseph said, some committers leaving, but happy to have them to as a new members join this community. So yeah, I hope this can be continue to happen. Next year might be another group of people join this community, and then next year another group of people join. So basically make new committer, new contributor, more and more.
So I think all of you have more insight into what happens on the dev mailing list than myself, but things that worry me a bit is not only your elephant hack, but also what happens at the companies behind the scenes. So I think this is not public information, so we don't want to go into too much detail here. But looking at certain committers in Kafka, where people leave and stuff like that, and when you have big reorganizations in the organizations, this is also something that might hinder the Kafka project itself or the amount of committers and contributors we have. But I wouldn't point my finger at any certain company here. Just the general problems of tech companies with hiring, with changes in return to office policies, stuff like that.
So, yeah.
On that note, just 1 second. On that note, that's one of the things that I'm usually looking at the projects as well, is what is the distribution of employee diversity of basically who pays the salaries of the committers. And obviously, when I started working at Aiven 4.5 years ago, the distribution of committers on Kafka was extremely biased towards one company. Nowadays, I can clearly say with even data that distribution looks better than what it looked back then. And one of the things that is probably not so much related to the number of committers and whether employed is also who are proposing the KIPs. And right now, it's not just one single company sponsoring developers to push KIPs. It's basically different companies having different people pushing for new KIPs for improvements on Kafka. So that's a nice indicator on the healthiness of the community, and that we don't just depend on one single company thinking it's still worth contributing to this project. Because right now, if you look at the KIPs, yes, plenty of KIPs will come from Confluent or IBM and Confluent together if we count them as one now. But we also have plenty of KIPs coming from other parts of other companies. We have ourselves. So Aiven, for example, we have also Slack did a couple of them, and a couple of Stan was proposing lately on reading from object storage directly. These are proposed from Slack like a couple of days ago. So there are plenty of companies around proposing new changes. So that's a nice sign of healthiness on the community.
I think that's a really nice point for us to leave the kind of the history of 2025. I really like that as a note of the Apache Kafka project being like a healthy community, particularly right now where I know there are a lot of open source projects struggling with finding committers, reviewers, maintainers, dealing with people raising AI PRs. Like hearing that Apache Kafka is healthy is super cool.
I would like to push back on that, actually, if we have a little bit of time. I'm not sure it's as healthy as people claim it to be, because it depends on what we define as health. When 70-80% of your contributions, not people, but contributions are from one company, I don't think that's necessarily healthy per se. That being said, Kafka has never been very healthy by that metric. But when we have, sometimes I think about this, I don't have a definitive answer or an opinion, but hear me out. When we say we have a community, yes, we have somebody like Slack or Uber propose a KIP every now and then, and maybe they get a tool, maybe they contribute it, etc. I know even the Uber KIP, the tiered storage, had a lot of help from Confluent and Aiven to get over the line. But I feel like these companies, I don't think they are part of the community, but they're not somebody who would die on a hill for a certain Kafka feature or for a certain development of Kafka. I think when you don't have these companies' revenue or business metrics be impacted by the direction of Kafka, I think it's very easy for that one company, which basically has all of its revenues impacted by Kafka, steer the direction. Now, that being said, I don't want to claim anything. I think they have been an amazing steward of the project so far. Now, with a change of management, I think that's at a real risk, and only time will tell what will happen. I don't have a prediction on that. But I'll basically challenge that. I don't think it's a chaotic community per se, and I'm not even sure we have a way to fix that given the current business dynamics of the space.
I think it's a fair point. I think we can touch on that a little bit more in this next section. I will segue us on a little awkwardly just for the interest of time. But we've looked at a little bit about where we've been for 2025. Obviously, with the last few weeks, we've had a lot of news with IBM Confluent, with free tier, with more work on diskless. If we talk about where we are right now, there's a lot of shifts in the Kafka ecosystem. I'd like to start us off here before we head on to the elephant in the room. It's something that I've come back to a few times this year in talking to people about Kafka, which is Kafka is more popular than ever. People are adopting it. It is a extremely popular tool, but we are also seeing more than ever this kind of proliferation of Kafka compatible streaming solutions or drop-in replacements for Kafka. Why are people working on replacements or alternatives for Kafka? And why are people potentially adopting some of these tools?
My experience from a few customers is there are people that hate just Java. And just for the reason of hating Java, people start competing projects that are not Java, that are nowadays primarily written in Rust. And then you can advertise it as, yeah, this is Kafka, but it's better because it's written in Rust or something like that. There are projects like that, but I hope at least that this is not the main motivation. And I think Kafka has the problem, as with any large open source project, it moves relatively slowly. And we see that with WarpStream or even with your Inkless project, if you want to change, or if you have an innovation and you want to make it happen faster, you need to move, or you might need to move away from the core product and then say, yeah, this is Kafka, but we are using another storage system, which makes it 80% cheaper or whatever. I think this might be one big motivation here. And maybe another, but I'm not sure whether this is true, is if you want to start I'm not sure about that one. If classical companies start to say, yeah, this messaging system we have is also Kafka compatible and want to integrate it into their existing infrastructure, maybe this is also a reason, but I'm not sure about that one.
And I will go deeper into your last line of thought. I do believe that's one of the reasons. So yes, Kafka is a big open source project. That means innovation will happen slowly, as with any other type of projects. That's a given. I think that everybody would agree on those things, or would not die on a hill for those ones. What I do believe it happens as well is that companies finally realize that they can, if they want to make a business and they want to make money out of it, open source is not a strategy for making money. As in, you cannot simply say, I create an open source project and magically money will fall to my hands because that's my strategy. So finally, people realize that's not a strategy. So one of the easiest things to move away from that one is, I know Kafka is market leader on that space. I want to take over the market leader. So I will take their API, which is the only thing that I can take, no problems. And I will have a proprietary version of it, either with another language, because I hate Java. I agree with you, Anatoly. That's probably a reason of why some people do those things. But the reason as well is, hey, I want to keep my intellectual property, so I have a different business model that is not just selling commodity or selling support, but rather selling a license, which is a way better, easy, and scalable way of probably selling your new business that you're starting. I'm having new licenses. It's easy to monetize those things. So I do believe that's one of the reasons why we see so many movement in there, is because companies realize probably need to create a copy of that one. If I want to take the leader out, I will need to create my own proprietary version of it. And with that one, I can tackle those things. So I think that's one of the things that can happen.
I would take it as a good news, at least for Apache Kafka. It means many people want to use Kafka, and like Joseph said, people smell that there could be some money that I can take from this market. So when I develop something newer with more advantage than the Apache Kafka, then it will bring more attraction than the older one. But I want to say something about that. It's a little unfair to compare, like Rupstream to Apache Kafka, or another language with Apache Kafka, because when you are developing something newer, you will check the older ones drawbacks and then fix that. So if you, based on this, and create a newer one which contains all the disadvantages, so why do you spend all this money to create a newer one? So I don't think that it's fair to compare these two. Yeah, that's my comments.
If you ask me, why do the builders do it? I think they're masochists. I think you have to be a masochist to try to create a product to compete with Kafka. And I really believe that. There's a couple of things to unravel here, but basically Kafka's network effect is so strong, both in terms of the API and the user base and the community and the open source license and being able to hire developers for this, that it's almost impossible to destroy this unless you build something that's at least 10x better, in line with the 0 to 1 book by Peter Thiel or general startup thinking. It has to be at least 10 times better. The reason WarpStream got some success is because they claimed it was 10 times better, and in some ways it was. In operations, in cost, it wasn't. That was a lie by the marketing, but everybody lies in marketing. But again, when you give the impression of being 10 times better, people then start considering you. And it's worth saying, even WarpStream, and I know it's not a fair example because things are different, but even WarpStream uses the Kafka API. So in a way, it's not even building against Kafka, it's building with Kafka, because when you use the Kafka API, you're basically integrating yourself within the Kafka network effect. So something that's competing with the Kafka network effect, I would say, is, for example, Northgard or S2, or there was this Rust-based project too that was trying to make a faster Kafka. I haven't forgot its name because I'm just not interested in looking at it, because how are you going to dethrone Kafka? Well, it's still a messaging system. It's still a lock, unless you have some very novel idea of, let's say, introducing indexing or a table-based raw API or some brand new, simpler API, something that's really going to compel big enterprises and users to move away from Kafka to your new project. I don't think it has any merit. And on the same line, it's very, for whatever reason, it's very popular to bash Kafka today. And Joseph had a good point. You need to sell licenses some way. You need to sell a proprietary product some way. And you can build a proprietary product, that's fine. That's a little bit easier to use in Kafka. Maybe it doesn't have some bug or scales nicer, etc. But how do you sell that? You don't sell that by saying, hey, we're 20% better than Kafka, because the people will look at you and they'll say, I don't care. I don't care. I don't want to pay for a new project that's going to die in 3 years just because you're 20% better. So you have to introduce some FUD. You have to introduce some FUD, like, for example, how Red Panda does, and says the JVM is so slow, the garbage collection pulse will stay for 2 seconds to crash your applications. Use our C++ thing because it doesn't have GC. Yes, but no. If you know anything, you know that that doesn't really matter. That doesn't really move the needle. Kafka doesn't have issues with GC, and the JVM is notoriously hated, infamously hated. Everyone hates the JVM. I mean, I'm not a fan of Java either, honestly. I was never a fan of Java. I work in it, I like it, it's okay, but I'm not a big fan. I get why people like to bash it. But then again, you can bash a language, but you don't need to bash the software built in it. Kafka is software that works pretty fine, all things considered. And because it's so popular and because everybody uses it, that's why people have found all the issues in it, and then they just sort of blow them out of proportion. So I don't think Kafka is hard to manage. I don't think Kafka is expensive to run. Kafka can be slow. It can be expensive to run. It can be slow to scale. It can give you issues if you don't know what you're doing. But that doesn't mean that the other solution isn't like that too. Any software can be misused if you don't know how to use it.
My next question was going to be, why do people still use Kafka, and what keeps Kafka winning despite all these other alternatives? I think you've done an absolutely brilliant job of answering that, Stan. Moving on to the topic on everyone's lips. Luke, obviously we can't talk about the present of Kafka in 2025 without addressing the IBM acquisition of Confluent that has been sort of announced this week. You're, both kind of an IBM employee under Red Hat and an Apache Kafka committer, so you're in sort of a unique position here. Are you excited for some of your peers in the Apache Kafka community to become your colleagues now at Red Hat?
Yeah. Short answer is yes. Quite exciting to have all the experts to join our team, and sometimes I need to discuss with someone, but not everyone in our team are experts in all the areas in Kafka. Like in craft, we know all the craft experts mostly stay in Confluent. So quite exciting to have to be the team members with them. But on the other hand, of course, it's kind of fixed or feeling that yesterday we were still competitors. Yeah. So, but yeah, I hope after we become one company, we can still work together to make the Apache Kafka a better community, and to come out a more better innovations on this community.
Great stuff. Opening this up to everyone else, I'm sure everyone has lots of thoughts about this. What do people think that this consolidation might mean for the streaming industry right now?
So let me start with one thing. The current PMC chair is Mikael, who is a colleague of Luke, for example. He has been doing a great job. So I do believe Red Hat / IBM, because I think that was also a move, right? Recently from you being under Red Hat umbrella to now being under IBM umbrella. But that was a really great job being the public face, or the one that tries to bring everyone together in the community and act as neutral as one could be. And I think that was a great job. So I don't have doubts on that aspect, as in IBM will still honor the same deal as we had before, and they will continue acting on the best interest of the project itself. But also that would be stupid not doing those things. Aiven, Confluent, IBM, Amazon as well. Any company that has Kafka as the thing they sell, they need to care about that. If they don't care about it, it's throwing rocks on your own roof. So that should be on the top of everyone's mind. Nobody wants to kill Kafka when they have so much interest vested on it. So I do believe IBM will put the best interest of Kafka up in front, but obviously addressing the other things, the amount of committers that IBM will accumulate, it will be dangerously high. And that's not only a problem for the balancing of the voting mechanisms, but also on how it's reflecting to the community. But then things like CRA, so like the Cyber Resilience Act from European Union as well, that also has an impact on how much a project, open source project, is governed or controlled by one single entity. And the more you enter into this arena, the more trouble the project is in, and the worse situation in CRA aspect they are. because then it's seen as a project for that company. So it's a complicated thing, and I think that needs to be addressed somehow, and we need to look at that one.
Can you talk more about the CRA? What is this legislation?
Oh, yeah. If I start talking about that one, we'll probably take 3 hours of that one. But basically, if you look at the Cyber Resilience Act, is a law that was passed recently by the European Union, and it starts nice, as every single European law that is written. If you look at it from eagle-eyed point of view, it's awesome because it basically guarantees the rights of users. So if you buy a software good, you as a user, as a consumer of that one, you need to have a guarantee that your bugs will be fixed. As in, if there are security issues, you will have the security issues fixed and pushed to you, and nobody can hide behind and say, oh no, I'm not doing any of those things. And that applies to open source software. That defines then different categories of companies providing services on open source, and you can be either a steward or a provider or a there was another word, but it's basically for non-profits. Basically, non-profits are exempt of any of those responsibilities. All the other ones need to react to any single CVE, for example. So now you as a provider, no matter what you are, no matter what relationship you have with Kafka, even if you don't have any committers, you might be, if you're contributing to it or if you're offering it as a service, you might be responsible for the security flaws of Kafka itself, and you need to act on those ones, and you need to certify certain things. The problem as well comes on how is a project or how is a company roll with a project, and how the project governance affects certain restrictions. And that's not so much for IBM or for Aiven or for any of those ones. That's also for the Apache Software Foundation, because the Apache Software Foundation can claim that is a steward only if there is enough diversity in their PMC group, so it's not controlled by one single company. As in, if every single PMC member will be from one single company, it will make it really hard to justify that ASF is working as a steward for this project. And again, I'm doing a really crash course on CRA, and I will probably have said a couple of imprecisions in there, but that's another relevant thing about that everybody's not looking really much, because it's a European law. ASF is an American company, 503.c or one of these numbers. So again, it's a not on the top of the most important thing they are discussing every single minute of their lives, but there is a lot of people in the ASF group that they are trying to make sense of the CRA and being compliant with it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the interesting stuff about the CIA. I didn't know about that either. Back to IBM and Confluent. So from my perspective, it absolutely makes sense for IBM to have Kafka under their wings. Why? When I started my career in IT, my company was quite a bit in contact with IBM, as IBM offers quite a lot of messaging products. You have IBM MQ, you have IBM Data Power, and you have so many different messaging systems under the hood of IBM, and all of them were kind of oldish or traditional in a sense. And IBM already contributed to Kafka and already had a service offering for Kafka, and now they get Confluent, I would say, market leader for Kafka. And for me, it makes absolutely sense for their portfolio to have it. What I'm curious about is how this works out with Red Hat. Because, so what I've seen, and I think this was also a discussion with Stan, I complained a bit about that Confluent was not that innovative. There wasn't so much innovation that Confluent contributed to Kafka, and Stan said, no, this is not true. And what I meant is they didn't contribute so much innovation to the ecosystem. And with Red Hat did a lot of stuff. Red Hat has Strimzy, which is an awesome project. Red Hat have the Besium, Apikuri, and so many different things. And I'm very curious how, for example, the licensing will end up. So will Red Hat customers move to that Confluent kind of licensing and also their sometimes weird cloud pricing, or will Confluent be more like Red Hat, or will they stay totally separate, apart from each other? What happens with the Confluent operator versus Strimsy, stuff like that? I'm very curious how this will pan out. And I don't have a clear answer whether I like it or I don't like it. I think it makes sense for IBM, and for us as a community, I'm not sure whether it's a good or bad thing. There could have been worse buyers for Confluent. Let's say it. It was not bought by Broadcom.
Yeah, at least they invested in the ecosystem. I also have some things to say. I think it could have been way worse as well. And I would also ask, like, how worse can it get? I mean, Confluent isn't contributing to the ecosystem. I think that's also an uncharitable take, because they are contributing to the open source project. And, I don't want us to hate on or talk about the two companies that actually contribute and ignore all the others who don't contribute anything. So I don't think that's necessarily fair. It can get worse if Confluent stops contributing to the core as much, or even worse if it starts blocking competing proposals for proprietary means. Presumably, they will be making more money in IBM, given the distribution, so there will be more revenue on the line with something like a diskless topics, let's say. So I'm concerned if that starts getting blocked. Another thing I can really see getting blocked or sort of killed in its tracks, I mean, it will release, but maybe it stops getting developed, is the queues. Why would you have queues in Kafka when you have IBM MQ? I don't know. There was a blog post on LinkedIn by IBM MQ product leader, I think it was, who basically argued against Kafka queues. He didn't make any good claim, but the blog post was basically negative about it. So I'm curious how Confluent will think about that. But I think the biggest change with all of this is the death of Confluent, and how Confluent as a story and business is basically, it's gone. And I think that impacts two things. I think that impacts the central nervous system narrative, where we said Kafka is going to be the central nervous system of your company, and every data is going to go to Kafka, and that's basically how you connect data within an organization. And what followed that sort of narrative was the 60 billion TAM, total addressable market, or even it got inflated to 100 billion total addressable market recently in their public filings. I think that sort of TAM, that sort of big market, is completely dead. I mean, if you followed the stock or the company, you would have known it wasn't true to begin with, because you can't have a 60 or 100 billion TAM with only 1 billion of revenue. But nevertheless, I think now that sort of story is gone and somebody bought it, I think they're not going to be trying to innovate in a way that would let them capture this sort of TAM. If it exists or if it doesn't exist, doesn't matter. So I think from that point of view, basically I'm trying to say, I think we will see less ambitious projects in streaming, because the most ambitious company of them all, Confluent, is basically bought out now and is going to be managed by IBM. The management is going to be completely changed. So I think it's very natural to expect some sort of change in direction, at least long-term direction of the company. So I think that's what's basically changed, if you ask me.
And I want to mention one thing, going off to one aspect that you mentioned, Stan. So look, Stan, myself, we are committers, and we are committers on our personal behalf and merits, not because we're employed by company X, Y, or Z. And why I'm making this distinction, I know that when you're paid by a company, your opinions, I'm not saying they change, but they might be influenced by the company that pays you sometimes, and you might take different decisions working at company A and company B. I'm not naive. I'm not saying that's not happening. I'm well aware of those things. So what I can definitely see is people from Confluent might stop contributing onto certain features that might compete with their proprietary offerings. But I don't think it will come to the point of blocking them or actively blocking them, because that would go against the project itself. And then it's when you're putting your company's you're putting your company in front of the need of the project. So then you would need also to ask yourself, are you actually acting in the best behalf of the project? Because you are a committer, a maintainer of a project, needs to put the well-being of the project in front and needs to care about that project. So I'm not expecting so much blocking for it, but rather the company not funding certain projects to be worked or developed on. That's something that I can completely see, but I'm not so negative on saying active blockage, because that would put a reputational hassle on many people.
I think it's a very interesting dynamic, definitely, to navigate that balance between being a maintainer and a contributor to a project, and also the day jobs that ultimately we all have to have in order to have the opportunity to work on and contribute to amazing projects like Apache Kafka. Before we move on to looking into 2026 and thinking about, you know, the future of the project and the future of streaming, one area I'd like to explore a little bit is around some of the motivation for efforts like diskless. I think, Stan, anyone who follows you on LinkedIn will have seen you do a lot of writing this year about the actual use cases of Kafka out in the wild, right? I think at Aiven, we've spilled a lot of ink on this idea of an 80% problem. So this idea that like most Kafka users are shipping, you know, less than 1 megabyte a second of data. So that's kind of like maybe perhaps small data at big data prices. Opening this up to kind of everybody, like, is this what is driving people to look for diskless or look for lower cost alternatives, that a lot of people actually aren't necessarily using Kafka at the big data scales that it was initially envisioned for? Or are there like other things at play here?
I can kick this one off, for example. One of the obvious reasons is costs as well. So you want to reduce costs, and that's something that many people running Kafka complain about it. When you have Kafka at scale, you talk to some people that have those massive, insane clusters, the biggest clusters in the world, and you start saying that they do, and I will quote, air quote, strange behaviors on their configuration, so their costs are not so high. And even some companies might say, actually, it's worth to just use this thing, even though it's not as secure and it might have loss of data. But the loss of data is so improbable that the amount of savings I'm having is worth total the risk of having an incident, 1 in a million. So it's totally worth doing those things. So claiming cost not a reason, it would be also not being true to ourselves. But obviously the other thing as well is Kafka has been designed several years ago, and the reality of where Kafka was deployed was bare metal, most probably. And we will need to talk to LinkedIn people, but that was it. That was bare metal. There was disks. And if you ask me, some of this dependency has leaked into the APIs. And for example, high watermarks, as in why you need to have these things, because you are saving things on disks, and a disk is not reliable, so you need to make copies, and copies take time. So as copies take time, you need to say, okay, who is in sync and who is not in sync. So all these things are a aspect. So they are consequence of the hardware that we were using back then. Nowadays, we have better hardware, better abstractions, and that's a modernization of Kafka. It's a facelift. It's like cars. You have one model, and every X amount of years, you get a facelift. It's the same model. It's the same look and feel, but now it's nicer or it's better. And it gets up to date with the latest innovations and the latest security standards. And that's on the car. So in our case, what we do is we bring that thing up to par with what the cloud offers right now, and what hosting capabilities Kafka now can make use of if it really embraces it. And it started with data storage, and it continues down the road.
Yeah. So for me, what I see is the distinct, or what we need to do is we need to look at the distinction, where do you host Kafka? And basically we have quite a lot of on-premise installations, especially me with my customers, especially in regulatory industries with high regulation, like banking, finance, many of them want to keep their Kafka on their premises in their own data center. And for them, diskless doesn't make any sense. For them, tiered storage is quite interesting, but even then, I have a few customers that say, I don't need tiered storage. Kafka is so cheap for us, and the hassle to set up tiered storage is too large. It's not worth the cost. But what I see here again is the option to store the data in Kafka forever. So to use Kafka as a log. Then if you are in the cloud, again, I would differ between hosted services like Confluent or Aiven, or Confluent Cloud or Aiven, and self-managed. So of course, it makes sense for Confluent or Aiven to go diskless because it saves you money, and then you can reduce the pricing for the customers. But actually, from a customer perspective, I don't care how you store your data. As long as it is reliable, I can trust, and I can trust you, and it's low latency. And whether you are using diskless Kafka or tiered storage Kafka or classical Kafka, I don't care. Give me a good price. But again, if you're hosting it on your own, then you need to think about diskless a bit more. And then you need to think, okay, is the classical Kafka with tiered storage enough for me? And maybe it can reduce the pricing so much that the hassle of diskless doesn't make any sense. Or if you say, okay, I have my 10 megabytes per second or more, and I don't care so much about the latency, even though it's okay and quite good. And I'm in I use 3 availability zones, then diskless makes sense. So I think diskless makes most sense for you as a provider of Kafka, and the smaller your Kafka installation gets, the less relevant it is.
Yeah, I can share with you that before Aiven start to propose this KIP about diskless, actually I started to do some POC in my local branch before that already, but 1 month ago, so not that huge and personal POC branch, so not like I haven't invest all the team to do that, but that means our team is also interested in this feature too. I agree, Anthony just said some customers doesn't care about the cost, but before Robstream comes out and tell you, hey everyone, watch me, your cost, 80% of your cost is on the cross network transition or what, you won't care about that, or you think that that's normal. You don't care about that much. But after that, some people start to ask us, or some customers start to ask us, do we provide similar features like Confluent, Flightcaster, or Robstream's feature? But yeah, we cannot provide them. So that's why we start to investigate it and think about it. So yeah, it's really good for Aiven's team to invest in this and have this KIP proposed to us.
It's sorry,
go ahead.
Jumping in there. I was going to say, it has been like really interesting for me this year covering diskless and covering Kafka to see that so many people kind of converged on this same idea. Like there are lots of different ways of approaching diskless, but I think it's probably a mark of it being a good idea that so many experts in the streaming space were like, okay, this is a good way of us solving a lot of the problems that we have as a project and as an industry. Is this kind of common approach to solving this big cost problem?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this as well. We covered a lot in this question, but first of all, so we've talked a lot about diskless, and this has been the topic of the year, and it's an amazing feature, and it's super interesting, and just everything ever since WorkStream release has been about diskless. We failed to forget that diskless is mainly most useful for the cloud, and particularly in AWS cloud, because in AWS, the AZ costs are 0.2 cents a gigabyte. in GCP, it's half that. It's 1 cent a gigabyte. And outside that, in Azure, it's free. In Oracle, I think it's free. In IBM Cloud, I'm not sure what it is. Might be free too. But I think Anatoly raised a really good point. There's a big distinction between Cloud Kafka and on-prem Kafka. On-prem Kafka is still a very large segment. I think 50% of Confluent's revenue, if that's anything to judge, comes from on-prem. And I think on-prem contracts are usually less, i.e. cheaper than cloud, potentially. So it might even be a higher real distribution. So the on-prem customers or on-prem users of Kafka aren't really impacted by diskless and they don't care about it. Then we have the cloud users, and out of them, let's say there's a split between AWS, GCP, Azure. I think the AWS customers are the only ones that really care about it. And then secondly, there's the fact that some people get massive discounts on networking because for AWS, it's pure margin. So they can really discount it very heavily up to 90% or more, depending on how big you are. It's our private number, so I don't know how much they discount for everyone. So it seems like the use case as a cost-saving perspective of actually moving the needle isn't that large or isn't that applicable to everybody as we might think, given the hype around it. That being said, it's more than just cost. It's the operations as well. It greatly simplifies Kafka, makes it easier to manage, makes it easier and faster to scale up and down. But it's an interesting proposition. That's why I like where Apache Kafka is in this, because we still keep the flexibility of we can offer you classic topics, we can offer you diskless topics, we can be cloud native to an extent, and we can be on-prem native to an extent, whereas something like WarpStream, for example, is just cloud native, is just S3, up to soon was just slow S3 as well. So it really limits how much it can penetrate the market in a way. So I think that's something we need to think about as a community and not forget. It's easy to ride the hype train of cloud native, diskless and everything, but we still have to invest in everything else because that may be where the market heads. We're also getting small. Some people talk about moving off of the cloud and onto on-prem as well. So it would be a shame if Kafka put all of its eggs in the cloud basket. And yeah, you also asked me about the cost, small data applications, paying big data tax, I think you said. I don't think diskless is a fit there at all. Diskless is for the many megabytes a second, or maybe hundreds of megabytes a second workloads. I think Kafka it really surprised me to learn how often Kafka is used for small workloads. I mean, I knew it before after working in the industry, but I think it's sort of misapplied. There are a lot of benefits to Kafka, like, of course, the schema, the OLTP, the network effect, and just organizationally as well. Organizationally, it's a big thing to have your data in one place and have it standardized on one API. So it would be hard to go to a big enterprise with, let's say, 1,000 people and say, hey, move out of Kafka, you're just using it for 500 kilobytes, move to Postgres. But importantly, I think the newer startups or people who are basically building new products are very critical with this. And new developers are very critical with just adopting a technology just because, let's say, it's hyped up or everybody is using it or etc. People very much value simplicity today. And even if you have a hosted Kafka offering, still can't go around the complexity of the API. There are much simpler solutions out there. So yeah, I think I would basically conclude this by saying there are a myriad of use cases for which Kafka is a fit and Kafka isn't a fit. And within those use cases, which is a fit, it again matters how you're deployed, how big you are, and what the use case is.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, often, the answer to what are people using Kafka for is almost everything, right? It's a very versatile tool. So we've looked a little bit about the past and present of Apache Kafka. Let's look a little bit at the future now. One question I'd love to ask you in particular, Anatoly, as someone who's spent a lot of time training people and getting them up and running with Apache Kafka. What advice would you give to people who, in the new year, I don't know if people have learned Kafka as a New Year's resolution, but maybe they do. If people are learning Kafka in 2026, what advice would you give them? And would that differ from advice that you would have given them at the beginning of this year?
That's a good question. I think the most important thing is understand what a log is and how you use a log. Everything else from that is on top of it. So I think in before times, I focused much more on the technical perspective and consumer group rebalance stuff and so on. And nowadays I try to reduce the amount of technical details. And this is also what I'm looking for, or what I'm hoping we as a Kafka community can get to, is what is the minimal amount of knowledge you need to get Kafka running and using it. I'm still not sure what it is. Of course, you need to understand topics, and you need to understand partitions. So what I like to focus on are the delivery guarantees. And again, this has nothing to do with Kafka. It has to do with distributed systems, with transaction, and the log. And as soon as you get this thing right, the rest of it is complex and complicated, but you can derive it by yourself if you have more time. So focus on the log, understand your delivery guarantees that you can get with the log, and don't think so much about scaling, except you're a large company and you have a lot of data.
Opening it up to everyone else, if you were giving anyone advice about learning Kafka next year, is there anything you'd say, oh, definitely focus on this, or maybe you can skip this? Like, are we at a point where we can say, oh, don't worry about Zookeeper, or should people still be aware of it in case they run into it out in the wild?
I mean, you throw me a bone there. I mean, there's still plenty of Zookeepers around, and there will still be plenty of Zookeepers around. And now I will throw one thing. 3.9, which is the latest version that still supports Zookeeper, will be one of the longer running versions of Kafka, and that's my guess. Many people are afraid of migrating to a different new system that they don't know of, and I can imagine 3.9 will be one of the sticky versions that people will stick to. So I wouldn't say forget about Zookeeper, not yet, soon, but you might still need to know that Kafka might run with a sidecar, and nowadays you just run Kafka on its own, and Kafka is self-contained, and you just need Kafka to run Kafka. But in my times, and then you need to say those things to the newcomers as well, mind that you might still find Kafkas out there using this sidecar. So I wouldn't just, we killed Zookeeper, I wouldn't kill it from the learning paths if they go to the real world. If they just want to learn how to create greenfield Kafkas, absolutely forget about Zookeeper. Otherwise, there are still Zookeepers, and they will be Zookeepers.
I would probably tell people to just learn the API and learn the distinction between a log and a queue as well. So how do you consume data from a log, and how you can only have one consumer per log versus a queue and many consumers, and potentially out-of-order processing on that. I think that's something people get wrong a lot. I see a lot of posts on Reddit with a lot of upvotes of people confusing something that needs a queue basically asking, should I use Kafka for this? So I think that's very important. First, understand when you need a log versus when a queue would do. And then, of course, now that we have queues in Kafka, figure out if you can just use that feature. And then secondly, I think the most important thing is to learn the producer and the consumer API before anything else, because chances are you might use hosted Kafka. There are a myriad of hosted Kafka offerings, or Kafka API implementations that use something else under the hood. So I think that's probably the thing you need to learn before anything else.
Finally, I want to add it for tier storage that users should start to using that. If you haven't done that yet, it would save the storage cost for you to put all data to your remote storage. So I would recommend users to start learning that and use that and report any issues on upstream Kafka, and we will fix that.
Great stuff. So yeah, check out your Kafka API, producer, consumer, queues versus logs, and tiered storage. And maybe once you've done all that, a feather for your cap would be learning how to migrate from Zookeeper to Kraft in 2026. A useful skill to have, I'm sure. It wouldn't be a podcast covering 2025 and speculating about 2026 if I didn't ask you guys to make some predictions, although I know that's often easier said than done. Closing out, if you were to make one prediction for 2026, and I think there's plenty to choose from in the last sort of hour or so of our conversation, what would you predict to happen for Kafka and for streaming infrastructure as a whole in 2026?
Can I go with the obvious one that I need to say? KIP 1150 diskless is approved, and we are working on implementing that thing upstream. So that's my prediction. I mean, it's obvious, and probably I'm not making the headlines, but that would be the obvious one that we need to say. I mean, that needs to be said. I'm saying that one.
Sorry, Anthony. So I go first. I was gonna to say I don't want to see any companies got acquired by a user company because of any reason. But yeah, for the features perspective, I want to promote something that we are currently working on is the cross replication feature like cluster linking in Confluent. And yeah, we are working with Apple team and some open source for you team members, as well as Greg in Aiven's team for discussion on this feature. So hopefully we can propose the KIP by the end of this year or maybe the early of next year. So stay tuned.
Very cool.
So I'm not sure whether it's a prediction, maybe it's a hope. And my hope is that we will see more projects, not primarily in the Kafka community, or not in core Kafka, but in the community that make it much simpler to use Kafka and to understand Kafka. So this was what I'm hoping for, because it's still, in the end, it's just a log, but it's very hassle-some to use Kafka. And it should be simpler and easier.
Yeah, I have two predictions, one boring and one interesting one. I think the boring one is we're going to see more cloud native, movement to cloud native stuff. Maybe some of the KIPs about reading from S3 with code replicas or directly gets approved, and diskless gets approved and maybe even shipped. I don't know. That's the boring thing I think is going to happen. The second one, I don't also want to predict in just 1 year, because in enterprise software, things move very slow, and a year is not enough to do anything. But if I can expand it to, let's say, the next 2 years, I think Red Panda and Pulsar lose relevance. Red Panda the broker, not necessarily the company, and Pulsar as Apache Pulsar. I think those two projects lose a lot of relevance in the messaging space. And my reason for thinking that is that I just think the messaging space is too small of an industry to entertain so many projects and so much investment into all of these projects.
One interesting note around that prediction on Red Panda as the broker, I think, particularly coming on the back of their more recent pivot towards kind of AI, and a lot of the news we've seen at Current New Orleans recently is this notion that for streaming and stream processing, that this technology will be supporting AI use cases a lot more, right? Does anybody have any thoughts on that, maybe that potential future of like AI ML workloads being increasingly streaming and real-time backed in 2026?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Sorry to interrupt. And this is not directed at Red Panda, but everybody really in the industry talking about AI, and even outside of Kafka, it's a bubble. Everybody is building AI agents. Everybody is building infrastructure for building AI agents, but there are no real AI agents. And I hear it day to day. I see so many cases in my day-to-day life, which I think even an AI agent can solve some of these cases, and I don't see anything being built for this. So I think that bubble pops, at least from the AI agent perspective. And as far as the general AI bubble, when that pops, I can't give any prediction there, because that's a bigger thing. But I think Kafka is mostly useless for AI agents. It's all fluff, and it's a narrative based on nothing. And frankly, it's probably the most the most bubbly, based on nothing narrative we've seen in the last few years. And I think it kind of came out of desperation, out of these vendors who basically need to sell something to investors to fluff up their revenue because it's not growing like it used to back in the back 5 years ago when Kafka was hotter. We see this thing about real-time AI agents being built and stuff, but you can use Postgres to build an AI agent. And out of every AI sort of agent company I've talked to, or AI adjacent company I've talked to, nobody has said that the infrastructure is the bottleneck of building agents. We're still at a stage where we don't even know what the use cases are exactly. We don't know how to build reliable AI models so you don't get hallucinations, or you don't get an latency that's too slow and stuff like that. So whether you use Kafka or Postgres or any other like server you build yourself, I don't think that's limiting at all. And by trying to fit Kafka into it, I think it's really the wrong thing. There's very little use cases that can use a lock in general, and then on top of it, very little use cases that can use an AI agent that's using a lock. So yeah, I hate that narrative.
Me too. So I also agree with Stan that this AI hype, especially in infrastructure projects like Kafka, it's confusing people, and maybe it's just a scam to get more money from some investors that just looked into AI funding. I would say if you care about whatever this AI stuff is, then build good architecture and build tools to build good architecture. Because if it's simple for humans to understand where the data is, how the data looks like, what you can do with the data, it will be also simpler for your whatever AI stuff you will have in 2, 3, 4 years. And we all know that doing ad hoc queries over Kafka is probably not the best solution, and you don't want to have AI-powered ad hoc queries over data in Kafka, but you will move it to, I don't know, your database of choice and then do your queries over it. But of course, what I see is, if you look from the above, to have AI software that helps you to build stuff with Kafka, that might be useful to say, okay, I would like to connect the data from this bank transactions to these account informations. Write me code to do that. Sure, but that's simple. That's not about Kafka for AI, but using AI to build software and to support you in there. When this AI stuff started, I thought about, okay, you could use Kafka to move messages to your AI stuff. Yeah, you could, but this is just simple request response stuff. And again, Kafka is probably not the right tool if you want to do request response, especially because the amount of time you need to create a response for a certain message will vary a lot. And then a queue might be the better solution for that. And Kafka is probably not the right choice here.
Exactly. And I also just wanted to interject very shortly that Red Panda validates what we're talking about in a way. They're pivoting away from being a Kafka broker and being a broker in general. And their new announcement, at least, announced an AI gateway, an MCP gateway, some sort of thing for a human in the loop. They acquired, I think, a Postgres company. So I think that also validates that if you want to build AI infrastructure, you need a lot of things that are not Kafka. In fact, I think Kafka is the last thing you need.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I think it's something we're hearing a lot about right now. But I think if I were to make a prediction for 2026, it would be that perhaps not all of these speculations on crazy things we'll build with AI will necessarily come to pass. I'd like to thank everybody for joining me today. It's been such a treat to pick all of your brains about this. Like, it's always fun talking to the experts, and particularly getting Joseph going on open source project administration is always great. I'd like to give everyone an opportunity just to share like where people can find them or follow their work, and to thank everybody again for joining us today. Stan, I think you're probably a good person to start, as I know there's one place where your work can be found.
Oh, Yeah, well, I'll just Google the Kafka guy, and that's me. Sign stuff on LinkedIn.
Yeah. You can find me also on LinkedIn, and if you're into books, I wrote the account Apache Kafka in Action book, so you find it with Evanning. So maybe this is a good tweet for you for your Christmas present.
So you can find me on the Kafka community and pin me when you have PR ready.
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, also in the mailing lists of Kafka. And yeah, if you want to engage in some open source discussions as well, that they are not just on Kafka as well, I might have opinions on those ones.
Brilliant stuff. I very much like the idea of like, if you would like to get in touch, please raise the PR. Fantastic. Awesome. And of course, if you're interested in seeing more from Get Kafka-Nated, you can find us at getkafkanated.substack.com. That's our last episode for 2025. But worry not, we've already got some great episodes in store for 2026. Tune in on January 14th for the season 2 premiere featuring Apache Plus BMC member DNS Polizos. I'm really looking forward to that conversation myself, and hopefully some of you will join us there. Thank you everyone for listening live today, and thank you again to all of our amazing guests. It's been a real pleasure. Happy holidays, and see you all in 2026.